Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer, as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you. Always glad to be here.
You're welcome. Welcome to the show once again. Several big topics again today, Irina. But first, let's take up this Ukraine issue. Scandal there, and a lot of, and amidst all these things, a new peace formula seems to have come up. This time, 28-point formula about Ukraine, but discussions going on between the US and Russia. Help us understand what's going on in that part of the world. Towards the worst or towards getting better?
Both. In some ways, everything is both. It's funny. The news tends to focus on one angle or the other, but at the same time, it's usually everything is happening simultaneously, and much will depend on the implementation, on the execution, on leadership. Sorry. Wait, I actually don't think I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I can hear, Irina.
Can you just repeat the last part, because I feel like it froze and cut out.
Okay. First part is the corruption scandal in Ukraine. What's happening in that, and a lot of question marks around the government itself, the president itself, and a lot of things. And along with this, at the same time, a new 28-point formula seems to be coming up between Russia and Ukraine and US, but it does not involve Ukraine. Only Ukraine will be impacted by it. How do you see this whole thing panning out?
So there's two things going on simultaneously. So one is internal. On the one hand, the fact that at such high level you have so much graft related to energy companies, related to ministers and insiders close to the president. Of course, it raises public outrage, it raises outrage of investors and backers. At the same time, it's a sign of accountability, because let's face it, 10 years ago, all of these people would have not only remained in place rather than being forced to resign and investigated, but they would have continued making money and continued, being corrupt at even higher level than they are now. Essentially, based on what I understand, the level of corruption and the level of essentially the level of money being made from these sensitive situations has been cut by half from what it was in previous years. It's still not nearly enough. It's still horrifying. It's disappointing, and it shows that how difficult it is to actually root out corruption once it becomes part of your political culture. It becomes something so entrenched in the system that if you're not corrupt, you literally cannot function. You literally cannot get anything done, and you literally can't make money. Of course, the fact that people in many former Soviet countries are going into politics specifically to make money rather than making money and then using their money to try to do some public good. That's a completely different system from the Western world. It's particularly tragic that this reckoning is coming at the time of a devastating war, when you would think that public conscience that that the war effort would make it, would put aside these personal obsessions about wealth accumulation and um, power to focus on the common goal of winning the war. The thing is, I'm not entirely sure that even these corrupt officials don't think that it's not that they don't necessarily care about the war. It's that they're so used to functioning within this ecosystem that they may not even know how to act in any way that's different. There is a lot of internal peer pressure to conform. At the same time, however, it's very clear that whatever these financial shenanigans, horrible as they may be, the real threat is still very much external. And the 28-point peace plan that was leaked out recently underscores that the threat may be as much more political than it's actually military. Because let's face it, Russia cannot really make serious progress without political backing and assistance from the international community and especially the US. Sure, they're making incremental territorial gains whereas Ukraine is suffering from personnel shortages, but now the progress is minimal compared to the losses Russia is suffering, and economically the U.S. sanctions on some of its largest companies, albeit with various exemptions and exceptions and um, partial enforcements, they're still making an impact. They're still proving problematic, and Ukraine's strikes on energy and military infrastructure inside Russia are also setting the war pace back substantially. So what does that mean? It means that Russia needed some sort of a political trick to divert attention from its own dismal situation and also to gain leverage over Ukraine, if only tactical and temporary. The plan, I think, is more a publicity stunt to cause US to put pressure on Ukraine than a serious effort to stop Ukraine, because at the end of the day Russia understands that most of the West Europe and even the US are too invested to completely abandon the situation, especially even as Russia continues expanding the nature of its threat to Western countries with various acts of sabotage, the remarkably effective sabotage of the railway in Poland, the worst such attack since World War II, the continued attacks on the underwater sea cables um, in Europe, including a recent laser attack by a Russian spy ship on the British forces, which could literally be considered an act of war. Numerous smaller incidents, continued backing of political candidates all over the West. All of these things add up, and all of these things are not winning Russia any popularity in many of the governing factions. So Russia needed something that would at least even out the playing field from a political perception perspective. Especially, it was growing concern that the Republican view of Ukraine and Zelensky was starting to shift in recent months, and the public support for Putin, never really very serious in the US to begin with, was dropping even further.
Absolutely.
So their appeal was an audience of one. It was Donald Trump. It was not an effort to shift public opinion. It was an effort to send out a message that Trump can still be useful to put pressure on Ukraine. It used Vitkov, who has business interests in Russia and who was willing to do anything his friends asked him in terms of favors, to leak a plan that was bound to be rejected by Ukraine. It also insinuated in the minds of the extremely naive Trump officials that trying to leverage Ukraine with the threat of pulling intel and weapons would, and giving them stringent deadlines would back Ukraine into a corner and help Trump gain yet another peace deal to add to his Nobel Prize nomination aspirations. Clearly, they were wrong. First of all, Ukraine cannot cannot afford to fulfill the conditions that include um, cutting out a large chunk of its army, which is already suffering, as I said, from personnel storages. It cannot give up weapons. It cannot simply admit defeat and surrender to please Trump or Putin. And quite frankly, Ukraine is not nearly as dependent on the US, whether in terms of intelligence or weaponry, as it was in the beginning of the war. So the leverage is not what these people thought it was. I thought the idea that Ukraine and Russia would make peace by the end of the week, which is an argument some White House officials were pushing to the media, was absurd on its face. But I do still think that even the threats of these sanctions and lack of support can be damaging psychologically, not only for Ukraine, but also embolden pro Russian political networks elsewhere. So this is, this is an information attack more than it's actually a real serious effort to put an end to Ukraine's aspirations for independence in any meaningful way. I think it was just designed to cause disruptions and to help the desperate Russian networks.
Right. So, does it look like this 28-point peace formula is only for information, or is it, is there a truth into all these things? Because it looks like, as if Putin has dictated it and the US seems to have agreed to it. And if it is true by any means, then it looks like why does President Trump have to listen to Putin so much?
Well, there's a couple of things. First, as you pointed out, this document was filled with Russianisms, essentially phrases that would not be used by a native Russian speaker, which means that Vitkov, Jared Kushner, and whoever else was involved in this effort didn't even do a cursory job of editing the document. They just simply passed it on, perhaps as a favor, as a business favor to their partners. Dmitriev is not an official. He is literally a businessman who nevertheless takes part in negotiations. Meanwhile, Foreign Minister Lavrov has been gone from the major appearances for a while now. Allegedly, he's been sidelined after Putin's displeasure over the cancelled Budapest summit with Trump. So, what we are seeing is clearly the Trump team did not put much thought into this document. Moreover, there's conflicting information coming out about the nature of this document, with some sources claiming that this was only an initial draft and has not gotten very far in terms of review and approval, and it was leaked prematurely at a very early stage, while others claim that the plan is exactly to be applied exactly as is, which is why the US is now pressuring Ukraine over moving forward, even as so many people are claiming that this was not for public viewing and it was an early draft and would have been revised somewhere along the way. The point to note, however, is that regardless of what stage the draft was actually in, Ukraine was never consulted. It was never part of the negotiation. So the appearance is that US is once again switching positions, siding with Putin and trying to impose a solution on Ukraine without considering its sovereignty concerns, simply as a bullying way of trying to get to ram through a deal for the sake of Trump. And Trump too has once again switched to a familiar refrain about how Zelensky allegedly doesn't have the cards, something that's been proven wrong and admitted to be wrong by Trump himself in recent months, and by claiming that Zelensky is somehow holding up the peace process, and if not for him, the situation would have stabilized a long time ago. Again, not true, given that Putin literally continued attacking civilians in Ukraine during the last attempt at multilateral negotiations. So we are seeing once again, Trump fall into the same trap. Kushner and Witkov clearly having actionable conflicts of interest between their business priorities and the geopolitical nature of their meddling in this situation. Um, so it should not be seen as a real and serious initiative, but rather as a strategy to disrupt and divert the current trajectory.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Now let's move on from one crisis to another. This time, the Middle East crisis, and looks like President Trump and Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and they are to consider UN resolution with a path towards Palestinian state. How does this all look like? Does it look like that it will happen and peace will finally prevail? That there will be reconstruction in Gaza without disarming Hamas?
Well, the fact that the UN Security Council accepted this plan without any serious changes, even as Russia and China had abstained, indicates that there is a level of international support for this formulation. And many parties, for various reasons, find this current structure useful for whatever the purpose is. But in terms of which grants it some level of international legitimacy if this is something that is a high priority for some. However, in terms of actual implementation, this is extremely dubious, and it's funny because Trump seems to be applying the same outdated formula to the Russia-Ukraine process. Essentially, Trump is basically giving up on disarming and forcing out Hamas and claims he will move on directly to reconstruction in the areas currently under Israel's control, which is assuming that Israel will continue to control those territories for the foreseeable future. That said, the moment Israel withdraws, and they will likely withdraw because the Israeli society does not wish to continue operating in Gaza indefinitely, and this is what had caused them to leave to begin with. It's a high risk of continuous presence, high cost both financially and militarily, and it also is terrible from a publicity perspective because the territory is neither annexed according to international law nor separated entirely. So um, there is Israel is kind of stuck with it. So in the event Israel does eventually withdraw, if Hamas remains in power, they will immediately move back to consolidate the control over the territory, likely leading to the destruction of the infrastructure, the loss of investments, and generally a completely wasted effort. And this is the possibility that we're currently facing if the administration really decides to continue operating in a unresolved conflict zone and start rebuilding in areas that are likely to be destroyed almost immediately the moment the status quo is challenged. And that is likely to happen sooner rather than later because Hamas is reconsolidating its power not just in Gaza, they are growing their presence in the West Bank, where Iran continues to supply them with weapons. And recently, Europe dismantled Hamas cells in Germany and Austria, uh, which should come to the surprise of no one who's been following these events. Hamas, in the recent couple of years, has threatened multiple times to implement the strategy of building their networks and globalizing their operations internationally. The fact that they followed through should come as no surprise. Some of those networks were probably in place for a very long time, even preceding the October 7th attacks. So, what we are seeing is that the plan, in theory, is perfectly fine and acceptable to many stakeholders in the region. In terms of actual enforcement, there is no way to actually do it. There are no takers for the securitization stabilization force. There are too many unresolved issues that will not be easy to resolve. All of this is perhaps a political win for the U.S., but in terms of resolving the conflict, it so far has no teeth to actually get that done.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll have to see how much this happens and how far peace actually becomes a reality in that part of the region. Moving on from this, MBS was in Washington, and then there was the Saudi Investment Forum, and Trump considers sale of 48 F-35 to Riyadh. Help us understand what was this whole visit about, and how does it look like? Do you think this will wean away Saudi Arabia from Russia, because they have become quite thin in recent days?
Hmm. Well, funny you mentioned that because, quite frankly, the word Russia never appeared in any of the headlines concerning this, and yet in the background, it very much was part of the picture. However, the more immediate proximate cause for this visit was Qatar getting a huge defense deal and being elevated to a major non-NATO status, which the Saudis felt threatened by and also slighted by. um, the initial idea of pushing for a full defense treaty with the United States is not new. I wrote something about that in 2019 during Trump's first term. For a variety of reasons, it was never pushed and followed through at the time. But after Qatar got this huge deal, it suddenly was seen as a priority in Riyadh, and the decision was made to take drastic action to move it forward. Now, uh, Trump has been in talks with the Saudis for the past weeks regarding the F-35s, regarding defense deal, and for months since his last visit to Saudi, he's been in talk about civilian nuclear program. Um, as far as it is known, U.S. ultimately agreed to some components of that program, but where that actually goes in terms of long term is still unclear. Many of the details of these talks have not emerged. On paper, Saudi came away with a lot, while in exchange for relatively little, they got the approval for AI chips they needed. They got some sort of a security commitment from the US. Unclear whether that commitment is real, but then again, it's also not clear whether Trump's commitment to defense of Qatar is something real. Until this is actually tested, we will not know. Trump had agreed to sell to F-35 and actually made that announcement before the Crown Prince's visit, which indicates that most likely his motivation to kind of make Saudi part of the F-35 program, um, uh, get a lot of money out of selling 48 very expensive airplanes, each costing billions, and of course consolidating the security infrastructure in in the Middle East, bringing regional security integration closer, since Israel is also part of the same program. All of that seemed like a no-brainer from Trump's perspective. Now, the reality is actually much more complicated. I'm not sure that Saudis fully understand it, or whether they're selling it to their own domestic audiences in a way that is actually whether they're managing the expectations. The reality is the review process required for such an undertaking is likely to be longer rather than shorter. Congress is likely to weigh the Israel's concerns about losing the qualitative edge, because these are not just the standard model basic F-35s. They're going to be equipped with similar advanced features as what Israel has, and Israel has only a very small number. I think only one such plane, highly effective, uh, highly effectively updated by Israel's own technicians, but nevertheless, compared to 48 planes that Saudis are ordering, which admittedly will not be ready for quite a few years, is it's a if push comes to shove, and in an event of a confrontation, Israel will certainly be in an uneasy position. Um, Now, many people don't believe that Saudi Arabia is a real threat to Israel, or that Israel would, even in the event of a hostile uh, government attitude, would present a military priority for Saudis who are far more concerned about dealing with the Houthis' internal problems, or for that matter, Iran potentially getting out of hand. But the reality is, you don't buy that number of planes unless you want to project power. And uh, of course, some of it is related to Iran and Qatar, but also given the fact that Qatar is part of the GCC, and then Iran has normalized relations with Saudi Arabia, for the immediate future, these relations are stable and tolerable and unlikely to engage in direct conflict for the time being. With Israel, however, given that there's not only no diplomatic relationship, but no any official non-aggression pact of the sort that Syria sort of had under Bashar al-Assad and Hafez, it's entirely possible that in the event of something going potentially wrong, it's possible. You can't rule out that possibility, even if it's very unlikely at this particular moment in time. That's for that reason, Congress is likely to review this sale vigorously. It is possible that they will place restrictions and exercise tight oversight over its use by Saudis, and meanwhile, Qatar too has tried to buy F-35s from the United States. It's going to be a process. They're building up to it and participating in a U.S. base, and bringing their own planes to and building a separate facility is part of that process of trying to get to the F-35s in a way that makes it almost impossible to refuse. The Saudis did not follow the same path. Instead of trying to kind of slowly build public acceptance through incremental steps, and then buying a small number of F-35s just as a symbolic gesture, they try to essentially overwhelm their potential competitors by going for the jugular right away. How that will actually work out in the end remains to be seen. For now, the Saudis are celebrating it as a win. Um, in terms of technical details, a lot of the sales being announced, the supposedly nearly $1 trillion AI and other deals, the details are unknown. From what I've seen in the days leading up to MBS's visit, it's become obvious to me that many of those deals things that have already been in the talks for months, while others are the same deals that had been allegedly signed during Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia and recycled since his first term. So, how much of this is real, or how much of it is to make Trump give Trump something to crow about in public about his deal-making abilities, remains to be seen with time. But for now, if I were Saudis and Emiratis, I would be careful with over-engaging with the US, especially on the AI side, because we are seeing that some of that bubble held by a few large AI companies is beginning to burst. That's not to say that AI itself is a bubble. It's a huge area filled with unfulfilled potential. But when it comes to a few large first movers, while they have had a tactical advantage, they also have made a fair number of mistakes, which makes it highly likely that they'll blow up on itself and will not survive to see the second and third stage phases of the process of AI being built and integrated into everyday processes. For that reason, if the Saudis are seriously counting on deals with all these companies, they should consider diversifying not only with non-US companies, but with smaller and middle-sized businesses, which are more likely to succeed in the long run, having learned from the mistakes of their of the founding fathers in this field. However, something is telling me that Saudis are unlikely to move in this slower but wiser direction. They are probably going to try to move in with the biggest um, current actors and with the biggest names quickly, because they like a quick diplomatic win. And this is why, well, on paper they look like they're walking away with a huge win and getting everything they wanted in exchange for no serious conditions whatsoever, not even a commitment to Abraham Accords, of course. In practice, all of this will really depend on technical details, on political will, on implementation, on wherewithal and patience and ability to implement technical agreements and actually deliver on all these commitments and MOUs and deals that are signed. How much of that will actually come to see the light of day, it still remains to be seen.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now let's move on to Venezuela, where another, conflict looks to be opening with Trump considering military options in Venezuela. What has Venezuela done? What does Trump want from Venezuela? Who is with Venezuela and who is with US on this?
Let's face it, Venezuela has become a bad and dangerous actor in the Western Hemisphere. It is backed by Iran, Russia, and China, all of them aggressively adversarial to the US, not just in word, but in deed. They've been riling up anti American sentiment all over Latin America. They have been weaponizing cartels to smuggle deadly drugs like fentanyl into the US and to gain control of institutions and to essentially create secondary economies all over the US. Um, they have been grabbing infrastructure, telecommunications, building up military presence alongside major international terrorist organizations, and uh, and and in conjunction with Maduro in Cuba, utilizing intelligence networks to penetrate even friendly Latin American countries, spread anti-American sentiment, establish espionage against U.S. interests, and essentially acting as a very adversarial, hostile stakeholder in the region. So there's no. It's a highly sanctioned regime that has abducted people and used them for leverage. It has engaged with assorted terrorists from abroad as well. It's troubling for the region and it's dangerous to U.S. security and interests in the region. Um, there's also a very active opposition movement headed by Maria Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize this year. And so, in the event the regime were to fall, there would be at least a viable opposition that has popular support that could peacefully transition and put an end to these troubles. And with that, start unraveling the presence of all these hostile networks in this part of the world. Um, that said, I'm not entirely sure that Trump is seriously committed to this entire process. He may just be using these option considerations as a form of deterrence. He his recent statements to Congress were that U.S. does not yet have a legal justification to conduct airstrikes on Venezuelan land. There's been a lot of objects, but so far none of them have materialized to a concrete objective of displacing Maduro regime. Uh, it may be that Trump is trying to gain leverage and is actually fine with keeping Maduro in place if Maduro cooperates on some specific issues that Trump is looking to achieve. For instance, limiting Chinese presence in those countries or cracking down on the cartels that are targeting the United States. If any of those things come to pass, Maduro may yet get to keep his position, which will be unfortunate to the Venezuelan people and the entire continent, but will suit Trump's transactional, limited approach to security. Now, the official cause for escalation has been the combating the fentanyl smuggling by boats. The fact of the matter is, however, the administration has not presented any conclusive evidence that all of these boats were actually um, drug smugglers. Um, and the argument that drug smuggling presents the same level of risk as terrorism and could be classified in the same way has not been legally tested yet. Of course, Trump has designated many of those cartels as terrorist organizations, but so far um, there hasn't been a legal precedent for acting against them in this way, and moreover, um, once again, he has yet to establish that each and every targeted boat has actually been uh, uh, part of the designated cartels as well, as opposed to some cartels that have not been designated, or just random gangs or small drug smugglers, or even regular fishermen. In one astounding case, they were survivors of a strike, and rather than being arrested and questioned, they were literally just deported somewhere else, to their home countries, which is almost an admission that these people were not necessarily high level players or engaged in something illegal, which raises a question of US liability if they did kill civilians, um, even if they were actually targeting drug dealers. All of this comes amidst the official defense strategy reorienting towards domestic affairs in Western Hemisphere as opposed to any other foreign defense matters, including even China, that has been largely scrapped in favor of this domestic focus. And it basically seems to line up with Trump's America First and uh, vision of focusing on domestic affairs and staying out of international conflicts. But if so, this war on drugs or terrorism promises to be a long one. Displacing Maduro regime alone may not suffice. The cartels could essentially um, assassinate the next leader, or penetrate her administration and hijack the policy. And all of that may not be sufficient to put an end to networks that operate in other Latin American countries. So, what we're seeing is a very strange, phony war that may not result in a full blown conflict or even airstrikes or a coup. It may simply end up being saber rattling for its own sake, with some limited action to satisfy domestic audiences.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now let's move on from that part of the world to my part of the world. And in this part, Pakistan has opened investigation into the Islamabad terror attack, accused India, and India is investigating the car explosion as a incident and possibly linked to the Kashmir events. In another part, Afghan Taliban is to end trade relations with Pakistan. I thought they were coming on to some conclusion and some peace talks were going on. And Iran, it has ended its visa-free regime with India. What does it all look like? Where do you think things are going?
Well, here's the thing. It very much looks like the terrorist attack in New Delhi may have been a retaliation for the perceived role in India's role in Islamabad. Most likely, um, I very much doubt that uh, Indian security services uh, find effective use of their resources and time to attack potentially civilian targets in Islamabad just to cause problems. It's very likely that the Taliban or some other terrorist organization was responsible, given that they have been growing their military presence in Pakistan for some time. And it's just a convenient way to shift blame to India, which has started some political discussions about normalizing with the Taliban. And also, the attack on New Delhi could be a retaliation um, that is tied to this rhetoric simply to make a point. But it's also entirely possible that Pakistan is simply losing control of the plot. It's losing control of the very same organizations it fostered, and they are now increasingly operating independently, with still with semi-official backing, but it may not be some well thought out long-term plan by the ISI or the government. It could be some of the Pakistani assets simply either freelancing or attempting to cause limited chaos just as a way of detracting from Pakistan's internal troubles. All of that is it's a very likely scenario. Meanwhile, despite growing instability in Pakistan, it seems that Trump is betting on its military. It's seeking to turn Pakistan back into an asset of the United States, and he thinks he can have that relationship with the army chief, who he thinks could help centralize control over the assorted and at times conflicting government and military factions, and become, Trump's man um, in Pakistan. How I'm skeptical that that he's the sort of man that Trump can fully control, but I think at least temporarily Pakistan may find it advantageous to cooperate with the U.S. just to get money, political support, investments, and so forth, which leads us to another situation, because this whole story goes back decades, back to the Cold War, to the rise of the Mujahideen, the ISI attempt to control the worst of the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union, less for the sake of the Cold War and more for the sake of um, simply coming out as part of the internal effort to consolidate power against India and in favor of their own interests. Now we are seeing that decades later, these strategies are seriously getting out of hand, because even Pakistan cannot fully control the Frankenstein's monster it has helped create. And this creation is now turning on its master in a very predictable chain of events. They're seeing Pakistan government as corrupt and impure. They're seeing the Taliban in Afghanistan as a success story for a pure fundamentalist regime. All of that is leading to the fact that the Taliban feels it has leverage to not negotiate, not put up with Pakistan's condition for ending the conflict, and to push forward for more aggressive political and military demands, or and continue limited action. In the meantime, gaining territory, winning hearts and minds among some of the radical groups, and essentially see looking to rebuild the caliphate with in Pakistan. That would, for in the short run, it may seem as potentially beneficial to India, because it keeps Pakistan off balance, keeps it away from meddling in India and trying to instigate terrorist attacks. In the long run, a weakened Pakistan that is semi-controlled by terrorist groups, non-state actors, is an actually a more dangerous turn of events than the current status quo, bad as it is, um, because these non-state actors will not respect borders. They will not be limited by specific occasional operations, and they will not be listening to anyone's command. They will prioritize expanding and causing problems, and they will, in the end, continue into India with the same level of commitment as Pakistan's backed terrorists, but with a much more popularity, much more great potential with greater forces, and a level of extremism that is surpasses that of Pakistan's corrupt military. It's going to, if this happens, it's going to be an even more dangerous turn of events, and hopefully this Indian government understands that playing these games and giving Taliban leverage, even vis-a-vis Pakistan, can backfire tremendously, exactly as Pakistan has found out in the past. I think there is a lesson to be learned from that development.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a dangerous world out there. And amidst all these things, something good is that India-US trade deal. The update is that US has exempted some farm goods from reciprocal tariffs. What should we understand? Something good is being talked about. Something good is happening. Do you think a solution will be reached soon?
I don't see major progress on overall framework, but I do see Trump as adopting this position of taxing some products temporarily and then removing the tariffs as a way of simply raising taxes and making tax money for whatever purpose he needs that money for. So it's a very tactical deal that has nothing to do with greater relations. It's just convenient and part of his strategy. The other issue is that he makes an economic situation worse, and he's like an arsonist and a firefighter. He's fighting the fires he started created. Clearly, tariffs are causing major discomfort in economic discomfort in the U.S. Polls by Fox News, which is very friendly to Trump, indicate that even most Republican voters are seeing Trump's impact on economy as negative, and this may simply be a way of letting people blow off some steam, not because he ceased to believe in tariffs or trade deficit, but because he at least temporarily achieved some of his goals, and now he is trying to balance it with managing the public outrage over taxation, over inflation, over the economy, businesses not being able to sustain their trade. So this is sort of a long-term game he's playing. I don't expect that. I think he finds these tactical moves as more useful than coming to some sort of grand bargain, which will require long-term commitment. I think he prefers not to stay commitment and to, pull these strings all the time to keep everyone of balance, not just India but also domestic actors, his own constituents, and essentially giving them a little bit of leeway as a way of manipulating and level of support, making people believe that it's not so bad, not implementing all of the tariffs at the same time for too long a time, but then reinstating them or taxing something else as soon as he feels that the situation has grown so comfortable. Unfortunately, this sort of economic maneuvering benefits him much more than it benefits either the American people or India. But I also don't think that this style of operation is going to end anytime soon.
Absolutely, absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Shukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
indeed for joining us.
Thank you.